Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It is a great pleasure to see all of you. So glad that you could be here with us this morning. We are missing Bill and Anita, and we're thinking about them and wishing them well today, being a bit under the weather, and we're praying for his speedy recovery, and look forward to having him back right where he belongs in the pulpit next week. If you want to be turning to Genesis chapter 46, we're going to be looking at Genesis this morning and considering the story of Joseph. And you know, Joseph takes up a lot of real estate in the book of Genesis. And there's a reason why Moses spends so much time writing about Joseph and thinking about Joseph. And dedicating so much of this book to the intricacies and the details of Joseph's life and story, because he knew that there were things that we needed to know about Joseph and the characters that surrounded his life. And we know that we are committed to the authority and the infallibility of the Bible as God's Word in written form. And we know that it provides the divine answers to the deepest needs of humanity. It sheds unique light on our path in a dark world, and it shows forth the way to our eternal well-being and our eternal salvation. And it truly is a blessing anytime that we can come together like we are here this morning and open these books and consider the thoughts and the words that our Creator has given to us, as well as the instruction and the guidance that we can apply in our lives from the lessons that we can draw from men like Joseph. So I'm not going to hit every note in the tune of Joseph. I think we're all very familiar with this story, right? And so I'm not going to touch on everything, but I would like to quickly just refresh our minds briefly. Joseph is the son of Jacob, and there's a lot that we can learn from Jacob. In fact, we're going to look at the story, at a story that concerns both of these men. But Joseph was the second youngest son of Jacob. Jacob had many, many sons. He loved Joseph the most, though, didn't he? And in the King James version tells us that he gave him a coat of many colors. That's how King James puts it. His 10 older brothers didn't like the favoritism very much at all, and they hated Joseph. So they kidnapped him. They planned to kill him, right? But then they decided just to sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about a dysfunctional family. But God is with Joseph through all of this. And Moses shows us how God orchestrates Joseph's release from prison, and Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to the second in command over all of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world at the time. So Joseph saves the nation of Egypt from a severe 7-year famine. He also ends up saving his brothers and his family, who were at the time starving to death. In this really kind of a recurring theme in the book of Genesis, we see that where the folly and the sin of Abraham's family occurs, and how it's met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of Joseph's brothers into an occasion to save lives. And this is actually what Joseph says near the end of the book. He's talking to his brothers, and he says, "You planned all of this for evil, but God planned it for good to save many lives." And there's a very interesting story that happens in the middle of Joseph's account, and that's what I want us to look at this morning. In chapter 46, we're going to pick it up at verse 33. And I'd like to just set it up briefly. What's happening here is Joseph is giving counsel. He's giving guidance to his brothers and his father. They are about to meet with the Pharaoh, who is the most powerful ruler in the world. And so Joseph he spent time as a prisoner and as a slave, and he's now the second in command of the entire country. He intimately knows the Egyptians, and Pharaoh gives him an Egyptian wife He knows the Egyptian culture. He knows their perceptions. He knows the way that they look at each other and the world around them. And so Joseph is talking to his brothers, and he says, when you guys go in there, I'm paraphrasing, when you guys go in there, you need to stand a certain way, right? You need to speak a certain way. You need to refer to yourselves as servants to Pharaoh. Not we and not us, and I'd like this. We're your servants. He knows how they are. He knows what Pharaoh wants to hear. And he tells them these things. He gives them this advice that is going to help for them to achieve something that Joseph is trying to do here. And he's trying to establish a district in Egypt for his dad and his brothers. And so let's pick up in chapter 46, verse 33. This is Joseph talking to his brothers. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, what is your occupation? You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to Egyptians. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and brothers, with their flocks and herds and everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asked the brothers, what is your occupation? Your servants are shepherds, they replied to Pharaoh, just as our fathers were. They also said to him, we have come to live here a while because the famine is so severe in Canaan and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now, please let your servants settle in Goshen. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. And so I just want to stop here briefly. This is very interesting, and I think we need to remember, at least I need to remember, this is not the Pharaoh that Moses dealt with, right? Moses dealt with a different guy. That was a bad dude, so to speak. This Pharaoh's a good guy. He's a pretty good guy. He sees Joseph. He sees that God's with Joseph. And he acknowledges that. He wants that. He wants God to be a part of his nation. This is a different Pharaoh. This Pharaoh is discerning, and he is submissive when he sees Joseph being successful. He's able to interpret his dreams. He's bringing him into the fold, and he has decided to give him this district, northeastern district along the Delta Nile, beautiful, plentiful, water. You couldn't ask for more. Great area. And an interesting little factoid about Goshen, when we read in Exodus, when that bad Pharaoh is in power and Moses comes along later, it's interesting because in Exodus, it denotes that Goshen was the one place in Egypt that those plagues didn't touch. Israel was separated. Israel is another name for Jacob, of course. But we think about the nation of Israel that was descended from Jacob. It's kind of interesting to me, and I love that piece of the story. Goshen was protected. It was separated later when bad times came. So I'd like us to consider this morning, this Pharaoh, this account of Joseph and Pharaoh. We can see that Joseph is a master negotiator. If nothing else. He's an administrative genius. He's working to settle his family in Goshen, which will shield them from foreign and cultural influence. And it says at the end of chapter 46, Joseph is aware that shepherds are detestable to Egyptians, right? And so what's going to happen is Joseph has marked out this district, and this area of Goshen's being left alone, and the Egyptians, they allow it to happen. Pharaoh thinks it's his idea almost. And that's how good of a negotiator Joseph is. He advises his brothers. They go in and they say, here we are. We're in Egypt and we're up here. Wouldn't that be a good idea? Joseph kind of talks to him on his own. He gets the seed planted in his head and he says, you know what? Why don't you guys settle in Goshen? Joseph is extremely smart, and on top of that, he's made it seem like it's Pharaoh's idea, and I mean, he loves God, and he is smart. His character is amazing, and we're going to see that, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But to me, it's just a great little piece of the story that he is safeguarded. He has safeguarded his dad and his brothers, and all of those that were to come from them and from their line using the Egyptians' own prejudices. It's pretty neat. So let's continue just a couple more verses, and then we'll consider this all together. In Genesis 47:7, it says this: Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh, and after Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked Jacob, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." And then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So there are many things to talk about with this encounter, and I just want to touch on a couple. But this episode is easily one of the greatest scenes in the Bible. You have Pharaoh, who is the autocratic ruler of the mightiest nation on earth, on the one hand, and then you have Jacob, who's the patriarchal head of God's chosen race, through whom redemption would come to all mankind. You've got them here in the same room, talking with each other. And we see that Pharaoh's first reaction is, "How old are you?" Appearance is very important to Egyptian royalty, I think. And it maybe not, but I think it's kind of funny. I might be misreading it. But it seems to me, it could be two ways. Asking how old Jacob is could be kind of like a condescending royalty remark. Or it could just be, that he's inquisitive, that he walks in and here's the dad of this man that I respect and trust so much. How old are you? What's your age? Either way, it doesn't matter, but it's Jacob's response that's so informative and instructive for us today, it seems to me. And first of all, he says, "My days are few." So here we've discovered the first 130-year-old spring chicken. But when we think about Jacob's daddy, Isaac, right? Isaac's Jacob's daddy. It's thought that he lived to be about 180 years old. And Jacob's granddad was Abraham. Abraham lived to be about 175, it's thought by most Bible students. So I guess you could formulate that 130 years old is not much. And that's what he says. It's not as much as my father's. But really, when we think spiritually, and I think that's how Jacob is answering here. When we think spiritually, you could live to be 500 years old, and it's like that. In the grand scheme of eternity, it's a drop in the bucket. Eternity is forever. There are some things that you can say, and I think you ought to just be quiet and let words hang in the air sometimes. But really, eternity, think about that, is forever. And Jacob says, "My days are few, and your days are few." That is spiritually, that is a great perspective to have as a Christian. When he uses that language, "My years have been difficult," you better believe it. Life is hard. Jacob had a lot of difficult things happen to him in life. He had some hard things happen because of some mistakes that he made. Life is hard. That's easy to identify with if you're me in my shoes. I think about his oldest son. Boy, that was a bad time in his life. His oldest son had a sexual encounter with one of his wives. And his struggle with his relationship with Esau, that was terrible. His daughter Dinah was raped. It just goes on and on. The strife in his own family. Jacob was married to 2 wives. That's a bad idea. You talk about struggle. Not only was he married to 2 wives, he was married to 2 sister wives. Double trouble. Seriously, you talk about unrest, and on top of all that, you've got 2 sister wives who struggle with infertility. They bring their handmaidens into their marriage bed, both of them. He's got 4 wives, 12 children. This is a recipe for disaster, honestly. He's lived years of his life thinking that his favorite son had been murdered by an animal. He's experienced a lot of hardship. And when he says it, he means it. He really has. We see Jacob as a humble man here, coming before Pharaoh. And I see Paul in Jacob at this point in this episode. Paul said, if I'm to brag, let me brag about my weakness. This is essentially what Jacob is doing. He shows humility before Pharaoh by letting him know that my life, it's a pilgrimage. That is so fantastic. If we could hold that perspective in our hearts, my life is a pilgrimage. You know, this is something that we see throughout the patriarchal age. It's something we see throughout the Mosaical law. It's something that we see with the kings and the rulers and the judges. It's something that we see in the prophets. It's something that we see with Jesus carrying this thought forward and with Jesus' apostles. It's all over the place. We are strangers here. We're foreigners. This isn't our destination. Life is hard. You know, the walls come down and things come apart. This isn't my destination. It's not work. I'm not working to set up shop here. I have a new Jerusalem that's being built for me. You have a new Jerusalem that's being built for you. It's so easy to get caught up in the things of this life and what happens, and that's a great way that Jacob phrases that. This is just a stopping point along the way. It's a pilgrimage. And if we consider the words in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, we find Jesus talking just to make the point of this being carried forward. In John chapter 17, verses 15 through 18, Jesus says the following, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one, that they are not of the world, just as I am not of this world. Sanctify them in truth. Your word is truth. And as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, 11 through 12, as Peter likes to always say, dear friends or beloved, in 1 Peter 2:11, he says, dear friends, I urge you as aliens and as strangers in this world to abstain from sinful desires, which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits. Boy, that's exactly what Joseph did. Pharaoh could see it. He could see God was with him. This is what Peter is reiterating. Be like Joseph. Let people see that you're different. Don't be camouflaged in this world. We can have troubles, and we will have troubles. It's guaranteed in John 16:33, right? But God redeems. That's what he does. We never need to give up on God redeeming our story. Never give up. He is the great Redeemer. This is who he is. We know this about him, and we love this about him. He can redeem anyone, anytime, for any reason. It is never too broken. It's never too busted. It's never too late. If you can take, God can take all the broken pieces and turn them into something beautiful. And this is the overarching story that the Bible is telling us, that all these broken pieces are ultimately leading to the great Redeemer, Jesus Christ, who redeemed the world from sin. And Joseph spent a long time as a slave and in prison. Long time. God didn't leave him. Day after day, think about that. The Lord was with him. God was at work the whole time. And in the end, Joseph sees it and he's not angry. He recognizes in hindsight the redeeming work of God in his life. And here's what the Bible says in Romans 8:28. And you know this verse well. It's written on your hearts. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. In all things, that means in big things and in small things. That means in good things, in bad things. It means in exciting things, in disappointing things, in all things. God is working for the good of those who love him. It's incredible. Now, let's turn back just a couple of chapters as we come into the end here, the turn. And I just did something that should never be done. I said end, but I'm not really ending. I've had preachers do that to me before. That's sneaky. But for a minute, would you turn back with me a couple chapters? We're going to be considering briefly another point in Joseph's story. But this time we're going to look at Joseph himself in chapter 39 in the story. Joseph has been acquired, so to speak, after he's been sold into slavery. And he's been bought by Potiphar, brought into his household, and Potiphar recognizes the godly presence in the life of Joseph. And this young man who he's acquired has some rare leadership gifts, and his gifts of administration and management capabilities. And it doesn't take long for Potiphar to put Joseph in charge of his entire household. In fact, the Bible says in chapter 39, verse 6, with Joseph in charge, Potiphar didn't concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Joseph is totally trusted. He's given the keys to Potiphar's kingdom. And just when you think that things are about to take a turn for the better for Joseph, his story kind of takes a desperate housewife's turn. Potiphar's wife, his first wife anyway, Mrs. Potiphar, would have almost certainly been a very beautiful Egyptian woman, perhaps a trophy wife because Potiphar has a powerful position in Pharaoh's cabinet. And at first she becomes infatuated with Joseph. And then she becomes inflamed with Joseph. And the Bible tells us that Joseph was well built and he was handsome. And Mrs. Potiphar, as I call her, makes him her pursuit. And she says to him, "Come to bed with me." But that really is the PG translation because the original Hebrew is extremely crass. It doesn't leave anything to the imagination. Yet here is how Joseph remarkably responds to her in Genesis 39, verse 9. "No one is greater in this house than I am, and my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. He didn't even want to be around her. You know, there's an old Southern saying that I used to hear a lot in Tennessee. I didn't hear it a lot in Texas, but it's out there in the South, that's for sure. If you don't want to go into the house, stay off the porch. And, you know, there's a lot of truth in those words. Joseph is staying off the porch. He sees the temptation. It's clearly there in front of him. She's making it very clear. Obviously, she's attractive. Obviously, it's a temptation, right? And he removes it from himself. That's what he does. And wow, we can apply that in our lives. He doesn't play with fire. He just walks away from it. And you know, I think if anybody could have rationalized a little fling, it's probably Joseph. Think about the other side of this temptation, right? It's not just the attractiveness of the wife. He could have easily had a little fling with the wife, no one knows about it, put it right back here in my back pocket and use it anytime I get in trouble. I can bend her ear and say, hey, you know, you could think about the terrible things that people do, blackmailing each other and conniving and deceiving. He could have done that, and that would have been a temptation. He would have essentially had a trump card to get out of any situation. And so, you know, there's multiple levels here. Joseph's smart enough to see that, and he doesn't do it. He doesn't use it for leverage. He's faithful to God in the midst of disappointment, and that is the hallmark of his story. So here comes the turn. Potiphar's wife one day kicks up her sexual aggression up a notch, and she says, "Come to bed with me," right? And she grabs him by his coat. She's not taking no today. And so he pulls. "No, I'm not going to do it." And she pulls back And here they are wrestling, and he slips out of his coat and runs out of the room. She's standing there furious, being rejected again. She can't get him to do this, and so in her anger, she screams, "Rape!" And security guards come rushing in, and it seems pretty obvious that this is an open and shut case, right? We saw this with Blasey Ford in the Supreme Court appointment. The Me Too movement. Women are to be believed, always, no matter what. And this is what she does. Bad women know this, and they use this. Here's the interesting thing to me. Potiphar is the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, right? But a better translation of that word bodyguard would be executioner. So, Potiphar is in reality the chief executioner for Pharaoh. In other words, he kills people for a living. He had all kinds of creative ways of ending people's lives. And he was not a person who would have just thrown a slave in prison for trying to rape his wife. Are you kidding? And so it seems to me in the text, it's inferring that Potiphar, because he threw Joseph in prison and didn't kill him in some interesting way, Potiphar trusted Joseph more than he trusted his wife. He knew what she was up to. He knew who she was. He doesn't want to kill him, but he's got to do something. And so Joseph's thrown into prison where he spends the coming years of his life, and Potiphar gets to save face. So Joseph is cast back down to the bottom rung in life. He's done nothing to deserve this at all. And now there's a lot of people in the Bible that we see that make decisions that lead to disappointment over and over and over and over. We read about Adam and Eve. They take a bite of the fruit. God clearly says, hey, don't do that, right? Abraham and Sarah, they bring Hagar into their marriage bed. I mean, by their own decisions, they bring a lot of disappointment and a lot of heartbreak, but that's not always the case. Joseph's done nothing to deserve this. It wasn't his sin. It wasn't his disobedience. It wasn't his rebellion. It wasn't his unfaithfulness, but he still had to pay the price. He still has to deal with this. That's just life. He's the victim of someone else's decisions and choices. And he started off with a dream as a young man, and he became a slave just to become a slave and a prisoner. And that's just what happened. So here's the question we reach in this point in the story. Where is God in the midst of all of this disappointment? Where is he? Years and years pass before Joseph's story takes a turn. And for years he languishes in prison. Where is God in the midst of that? Some of you here this morning, you're in the midst of a chapter in your story right now, and this is the question you're asking. Where is God in the midst of these terrible, unforeseen things that are happening? From the young woman who grew up, who was abused and is now cutting herself, to the Christian mom who is taking care of a 16-year-old daughter who was paralyzed when they were hit by a drunk driver. Where is God in the midst of that disappointment? A better question may be, where is God in the midst of that devastation? Where is God when our lives seem to be wadded up and thrown away just like Joseph's? And strangely enough, the text answers that question. Look at Genesis 39:21. Let's consider this together. 39:21 says, "But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." God was with him. He granted him favor. And disappointment will come, and our tendency is to become bitter and withdrawn and become harsh and hard. But in the midst of our disappointment, God is still there. And when we love him and are called according to his purpose, like Romans says, like Paul says, we can know that he is working all things for good. Big things, small things, happy things, sad things. He's working everything together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And you know, all of us start off our story thinking that our story is going to go a certain way, but it never quite goes as we plan. And we don't know what challenges we're going to face, and we don't know what hurt we're going to have to handle. We don't know what suffering is going to come, but what do we know? We know that in all things, in every way, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And we know that. We believe that. We faithfully are committed to that. And we know that we're not alone on this pilgrimage, because the Lord was with Jacob and Joseph, and the Lord is with you, faithfully by your side, from this day until the last and beyond. And if there's anything that we can do for you this morning, we're so eager to do it. If you need prayers, if you would like a Bible study, maybe you need to be immersed in the waters of baptism this morning, we would love for you to come, and we would be eager to serve you. Won't you come as we stand and sing?